Welcome, dear listener, to the Worldcraft Club show, a show for writers who want to create rich, immersive worlds for their audience to get lost in time and time again. I'm your host, James, and I'm joined today by mod, writer, amateur draconicist, and
Dra-
dr-
Drag, Dracon,
I had a word.
Dracologist? Dracol,
Dracologist. That's what I
Dracol.
wrote on there.
Ooh, yes.
Dracologist, and my dear friend Dave Schmidt. How you doing, Dave?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm really good, other than totally botching that introduction with my made up word. Um, so let's just kick this off really with what everybody wants to hear. Top three favorite dragons. Go.
Okay, is it ascending or descending order?
Oh, it's got to be descending, right? You got to go from three to one,
Okay,
right?
okay. This is
I
so
think that's
hard, and
descending.
I knew we were going to talk about it too.
Yeah, it's
Um,
tough.
so I think what I landed on was Drago from Dragonheart.
Mm, good call.
Um,
Very wise dragon.
yes.
Yeah,
Um, Jormungandr, who I will defend as being a dragon.
fair. Chaos
Um,
serpent. Yeah.
Serpentine, and he has a breath weapon. He can like spit acid, so it counts. And then my top would have to be Leviathan,
Yeah.
um, just for like the depth of lore there and the various other mythological dragons that it's attached to.
Yeah. No, I love that. And of course, the what was that? Was that first one you mentioned? Drago. That was the Kevin Costner movie, right? Dragonheart.
Yeah, yes, with the dragon being played by Sean Connery.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And he's like a dragon huntery guy, and he gets caught in the dragon's mouth. And if the dragon closes its mouth, the sword goes into his brain, and it would eat the man. And so they sat there for like 3 days or something before they like came to some agreement. Yeah, no, that was a good movie. I
It's
like that one. I
it's
like that one.
actually like a con movie.
Yeah,
Like the
it
bulk
it
of the
is.
movie is a con,
It's
like
pretty
which is
great.
beautiful.
Well, it
I
was.
like it when it's a surprise con movie.
I feel like
Like
I've
it's
watched that one several times now. Like it's
yeah.
at some point or another. It was just on, and I checked it out. Now I think mine I had it as like Smaug, Toothless, and Owen Wilson from the Starsky and Hutch movie, where they met Will Ferrell and he made them do dragon impressions in order for him to agree to help them. So Owen Wilson pretending to be a dragon with Ben Stiller was just gold for me.
It's
Uh,
probably part of the MCU multiverse now. Like
I
it's
I'm behind it. I support that. No, I
yeah.
like that. Yeah. All right. So, this I think is the real true opening question on here. But um, dragons they just kind of seem to pop up nearly everywhere. They're ubiquitous in fantasy. They're all over the place. Why is it that people seem to just like they can't get enough of dragons?
I think that there's just something it's hard it's I feel like I can't answer that question nearly as well as I can answer like the what are the examples of it showing up everywhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because they do show up in like mythology and folklore across the world. Um and so there's somewhere there is some root to that, right?
Yeah.
That there's just part of the human experience is to typically to fear dragons. Like
Yeah.
they're in most cultures they're the villains.
Hmm.
Um, in like Chinese folklore, they're not considered um, evil, but that some of the Eastern mythology, which I guess I'm just less familiar with, is where you see them as good, but they are still incredibly powerful and typically associated with creation.
Yeah.
Like they're part of the cosmological story. So they've just always been a part of human culture for some reason or another. And that's where you're going to get different theories on. Well, it's all psychological, and it's rooted in fear of the predator, and it's some kind of evolutionary adaptation, or maybe it all links back to one single story, something that really did happen, some event in human history that just made a lasting generational impact. So I think it's a really interesting question, like the why, but I just don't feel like I can honestly answer it. It's just one of those things that's like fundamentally cool and interesting. Like what
Yeah.
how do you it's like it's kind of similar to I was talking the other day with my wife about um, miniatures, like models for war games and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't think anyone really understands why a tiny version of something is cool, but it is. And like, I think it's just like the same thing with dragons. There's just something so fundamental about it that it becomes actually harder to talk about rather than easier.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there really early on, right? It's just the reason why we love dragons is they're everywhere. Like you know what I mean? It's like that they're just it's the reason which is almost very circular. It's the reason we love dragons because we love dragons.
It's
Essentially,
almost
it's just
like a snake eating its own tail. It's just
some sort of cyclical metaphor. Yeah, I wish we could just find something that neatly fit that. If
some
only
kind of imagery.
some kind of myth. That just it's just right there at the core though, isn't it? It turns up a lot. I like this idea of this fear of some sort of it's I would argue it is like an ultra S tier predator. You know what I mean? Like it is the
Hmm.
quintessential above all apex predator. I like this idea that it sort of represents a fear of the sort of overwhelming power of nature. Um,
Yeah,
its indomitability in a way. Like,
and they're very frequently um, associated more so than with predators per se,
mm,
with the chaos of the ocean in particular. So you see this with Leviathan. Biblically, that's kind of the role Leviathan plays, is like a
mm,
almost a personification of uh, the chaos of the ocean. But it's similar
mm,
in cases such as Tiamat
mm,
or Lotan, which is like Lotan is sort of the another Mesopotamian myth that's linguistically related to Leviathan.
hmm,
So right, so in those cases, these are serpents that are representing the ocean and its dangers, and the same is true of Jormungandr, right? Like he is in the ocean surrounding all of Midgard, and he's responsible for like storms at sea and stuff like
mm,
that. So like yes, they represent predators, but like in their original mythological context, they're often representing just the dangers of nature, the ocean in particular, right? Because the ocean is still terrifying today, but we are able to avoid and or conquer it in such a way that it doesn't hold the same kind of like primeval terror that it would for like our ancestors.
I think really the vast expanse of space has kind of taken on a little of that mythos. Like I always find it interesting that in a lot of professions where luck plays a massive role, or I should say that there's just a lot left to chance, you often have a lot of mythology. Like theater is like this, which is why you say break a leg. And there because you have no control over how the crowd will receive you. Some nights you can be completely off kilter, forgetting lines, but somehow you're just on it. The rest of the cast pick it up. You might not have your hottest night, but for some reason you just got it that night. And then other nights you're rock solid and you get nothing. And so there's loads of mythology about it, and it's the same with being at sea, and it's the same with encountering these mythological. I genuinely believe, and this is definitely off center, but like going into space, there will be spacer mythology and questions of luck and things like that, just because you don't know if you're going to get hit by a solar flare or micrometeors, and there's not really a way to control that. And so it will be doing things like, you walk in and out of the airlock 3 times, everybody knows that, before you board a ship, or something like that. I can just imagine
Yeah.
there being mythology built around it, which is often tragically missing from a lot of science fiction, but I'm sure that would happen. um
Right.
I think in a way, dragons are a way to render this unknown and unknowable natural chaotic force, and it's to give it a name, and it's to make it to some degree knowable. Like if you're out there at sea and you have some sense you're in a Viking longboat, and I am willing to bet they did some sort of ritual prayer offering to Jormungandr before they got on their boats, and were thinking, he's riled up today when the storm started, because that's a lot better feeling than an indifferent universe has thrown a storm at us and will crush us forthwith. You know,
There's a couple threads I'd like to pull on there.
yeah, please. I
I'll
I
just
went
take
on for
them
a
in
minute.
order.
Yeah,
So first thing, I'm okay. I'm changing my mind on this. I'm terrible at this. I'm going to take them in reverse order because I found a way to segue better if I do that. Um,
excellent.
so I don't think that the Norse would have prayed to Jormungandr, and I don't know that for
Mm.
sure. I'm
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
I'm
I'm maybe more
speculating a little
familiar
bit.
with Norse mythology than the average man, but I'm
Mm.
not like a Norsologist. We have the word Egyptologist. I don't know if we have the word Norsologist. But anyway, likely if they wanted protection from Jormungandr, they were probably going to be praying to Thor, right? Because Thor was like
Yeah.
a more of a folk hero, and that brings us to something that's interesting about dragons and the way they kind of function. And I don't mean to jump the gun, but sort of the way they function typically in a story. We were discussing
Yeah.
dragons a while back in the server, and it was a friend of the podcast, Steel Stash, and
Oh
club
yeah.
member in good standing, who pointed out that oftentimes the point of the dragon is to prove the strength of the hero,
Mm.
right? Like there
It's like Commander
is
Worf.
right. Yes, I think that's what he
Yeah.
compared it to the Worf effect of Worf is supposedly this great warrior. His prime function is to get beat up to show how tough the other warriors are.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the same with dragons. They're this unstoppable force, but they're often in the story as the foil to the conquering hero. So you see this expressed in a lot of mythology as what is known as the Chaoskampf. So that took we've been recording for 18 minutes 30 seconds. That's how long it took me to get here. Uh, but
Let the records show.
yeah, we almost 20 minutes before I said Chaos Comp. But
The Chaos Conf is understood to be rock solid Dave bait in any scenario on the server. So yeah, just break it down for us. Give us a
yeah,
little overview.
so the Chaos Comp relates to what I was talking about earlier with this, multitude of sea serpent agents of chaos.
Yeah.
So Tiamat, being one of the oldest, it's sometimes argued how much she was thought of as a dragon in the original mythology, but she is described as having a tail, so we're going to run with it. Um, so Tiamat is slain by. Oh, I'm going to get all my mythologies all
Marduk.
mixed up now. Yes, Marduk
Yeah.
or Marduk.
Marduk.
I think, yeah. I'm not entirely sure on the pronunciation either. But so so she's slain by Marduk and basically like chopped up and turned into the various parts of the world.
Mm.
You see something similar in a lot of other mythologies, including things as far removed as Mesoamerican mythology,
Mm.
where two of their gods, I'm terribly sorry, I cannot pronounce these things, um, but one of them is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. That's probably the most
Yeah.
familiar god from the Aztec or
Yeah.
Mesoamerican
Yeah.
tradition. The other is in, I think, in this version of the story. Now, when you say Mesoamerican mythology, you're talking about a very large geographic area. You're talking about a very long period of time. So there's 1,000 variations of all of this. But basically, two brother gods defeat a crocodile that is just in the ocean causing chaos,
Yeah.
split that up into pieces and turn that into the universe. Like
Yeah.
you see that kind of theme over and over again in in the story of in the Baal cycle. Baal defeats Yam, who is the god of the sea, and either an aspect of his or a like friend slash servant of his named Lotan, who is like the seven-headed sea serpent.
Yeah.
And Baal killing Lotan is like how he establishes order in the universe and becomes it's part of him becoming the primary god of that pantheon. So
So
you
the sort of dragons present in here represent sort of a chaotic raw material in a lot of ways that
mhm.
is then brought into a place of order, and that is often in a creation story. Is that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And that's so it's a little like and then the biblical account there's most famously Leviathan's mentioned in Job.
Yeah.
But there's other places where the language shows up. Sometimes it's a bit more cryptic and doesn't make it into our translations.
Mm.
But um, there's also the story of Yahweh slaying Rahab, which is generally looked at as both a metaphor for, like in the context of the psalm that it appears in, it's a metaphor for God defeating Egypt and freeing the Israelites, but it's also Rahab is like a seven-headed dragon found in some mythologies. And
Mm.
so God splits the water and kills the sea serpent. And like it's very much borrowing from some of these accounts that were written down earlier in its
Mm.
language. So like that just to say like this is something that is just everywhere. So like back to Norse mythology, you have Thor and Jormungandr, who are going to fight at the end of time and slay each other at
Mm.
Ragnarok. Spoiler alert. Um, but
You've had plenty of time to read the book.
yeah, honestly, it's like it's the prose edda is like 1,000 years old, and so you're just it's not my fault.
uh,
but um, but yeah, so I would have to imagine yes, like these personifications of the sea do help people maybe feel a little safer about being out on the ocean, but they're not necessarily looking to placate the ocean, the sea serpent. They're looking to they're appealing to the thunder god that has conquered the ocean.
Yeah, and that's really again this played in really nicely. I like the way you tied that in to this notion of the role that dragons play in a story, and the Worf effect was a good
Yeah.
angle as well. This is honestly one of my biggest kind of saws is that I think the sympathetic villain has become a fairly standard sort of it's become a trope now. Like I think it was novel for a minute and now it's a trope. But it was this
Right.
idea that your villains always have to be three-dimensional. I'm not really a big fan of that. Like I think sometimes a villain's job is to be an obstacle, and I think that is an okay role for a character. Sometimes characters are not there to be fully developed, flashed out, fully morally realized characters. They're just there to sort of be a wall to climb and ascend. And it seems like dragons often play that. I'm even thinking about Smaug in The Hobbit, which, will be a dragon everybody would recognize. It's like they
Mm-hmm.
really had to stretch his screen time in the movies, because in the books, Bilbo basically just gets there and like taunts him for a minute, enters into a little battle of riddles, and he's like, Bower Rider, the lake men, I'm gonna light those guys on fire, and just flies out and gets killed by Bard off screen. Like
Yeah.
for a good portion
Yeah.
of the story. You then get the retelling of what happened, but it's just sort of like it's um the dwarves are just dicking around in the mountain for a good long while, like not knowing really what happened. And it's like, it's hilarious because they're like picking out treasure and they're like, I guess he's coming back. And like, it's really sort of anticlimactic, but they had to like extend it in the movies to make it interesting because they didn't want to waste Benedict
Yeah.
Cumberbatch like crawling around on all fours hissing and mocap. So they had to give him something to do. Um,
Yeah. I'm sure
but
there's
yeah,
plenty of B-roll that was just,
I want it. I want them to release
yeah.
just 3 to 4 hours of Benedict Cumberbatch just creeping around. Like, why not? Like,
Peter Jackson just hasn't milked it hard enough yet. We
they're,
need we
they're
need
wait
the mocap cut.
they're waiting for America to hit a real low point, and they're like, release the footage. It was the same thing they did with the Tiger King. It's like the COVID hit, and then they were just like, time to release Tiger King. Everybody needs polyamorous tiger tamers. That's what America needs right now. Fire away. Um, but anyway,
Uh,
all that aside, yeah, it's like it's effectively a lot of times the dragon just winds up being this character to sort of overcome and to
right.
demonstrate this dominance of order over sort of a chaotic state of nature. And
Yeah, but it can be
yeah,
scaled. And
yeah.
that's kind of
Well,
the
dragons are
point of
usually
like
scaled.
right. Thank you for that.
You're
That's
so welcome.
that was good. I should have just done like the doc talk thing. Just but, um,
Yeah,
dragons can be um, scaled, pun intended, to fit the hero. Right, like
yeah,
they're
yeah, yeah,
just big enough to be a very scary threat to the hero. So you have like cosmic level dragons like Lotan, and then you have on a
St. George's
lower
dragon.
tier, right? St. George's dragon, um, Hercules fighting the Hydra. Like
Yeah,
they fight a dragon that is suited to making them look like a hero without
yeah.
turning them into barbecue.
But it's more like local menace than cosmic. Yeah.
Right, right. Um, and like it's interesting in the case of like Beowulf in particular, right? Because Beowulf and the dragon land fatal blows on each other.
Hmm.
But it wasn't the point was not for Beowulf to conquer the dragon. The point was for Beowulf to die with his boots on.
Hmm.
So like it's still made the hero what the hero was supposed to be, but without the hero actually conquering in that case.
I think this is an interesting thing about story in that it kind of victory when it comes to characters is a moving target. Like it doesn't actually have to be a win. It can be a it can kind of be something else altogether. It can be a moment of growth for the character. Like
Mm-hmm.
it could be a moment of surrender. If it's growth for the character, it doesn't really matter. You know what I mean? If the character is going to the next thing that they have to do. Um, that's kind of fascinating. I like that.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I'm totally spitballing here.
Yeah, yeah.
Like with Beowulf in particular. So the context is in the wider Norse Germanic tradition, right?
Mm,
Um, so in the story, he's conquered the monsters. He's been king for a long time. He's getting old, and there's a sense that he's getting soft.
mm.
Dying of old age just would not have been appropriate for a hero
A
in that
warrior.
culture,
Yeah.
right? Like dying in combat is like then you get to go to Valhalla instead of
Mm,
hell. That's hell with one L in this case.
yeah.
But so there's there's an off chance that like maybe Beowulf's based on some kind of real king at some point,
Mm,
and someone was like dying in old age. That's not how the saga's supposed to end. And so they're like dragon. He fights a dragon
yeah.
and he dies, but so
Goes
does the
down
dragon.
swinging. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like um, again, like the dragon is there as the set piece that allows the hero to show his true colors.
Yeah. No, I really like that. I think that's kind of a thing I keep thinking about is like the advancing of characters is the more important story, the growth and changing of the character. I like this idea
Mhm.
that it's also what in what way the character wins can be different. I think I often get frustrated when they bring characters back, mostly because it's not that it makes the death meaningless, or like I think a lot of people mistake world building problems for story problems. Like, or it's the other way around, actually. Sorry. They look at a story problem and they think it's a world building problem. They go, well, the issue is that, they bring this character back to life. And it's like, now I don't believe anybody can die. And like the world has an issue. And that's not really it. The problem is that the character dying was the character's arc, and you have reversed their arc. Like you have taken something like if like, Beowulf had died and then like his hand like rose out of the rubble and he came out, that would defeat the purpose of Beowulf's death and dying with honor with his
Mhm.
boots on. It would rob it of meaning. And I think like that's just an interesting, I don't know, sort of an interesting thing. It's a bit of a diversion, I guess, from the topic, but I guess in some ways, um, you kind of want to ask, what does victory look like for the character who is in the conflict? And I think that's a really good question that can sort of come out of this.
Mhm.
It's more generalized and less focused on
Right.
the dragon
And
element, but yeah,
what's a satisfying victory for the audience? Like,
yeah,
not just what does the hero want out of this, but like what's going to play well. And I think that that's important. And I think that sometimes that does mean, the hero dies at the end of the story. Probably not in the stories I write typically,
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
there's sort of um, there's some of us that just, they have to put happily ever after at the end, or it just wasn't worth doing.
yeah.
Um, but that does, I'm getting a death glare from my wife. I think because she doesn't want me killing my characters.
Ah, fair, understandable.
Some of them have become her babies apparently, and I'm not allowed to hurt them. I get
She's
yelled at.
adopted them.
But yeah, I think that does kind of bring us back around to the other point I was going to make
Yeah,
now a little while back, and it's related to what you said about space,
yeah.
right? And how that's kind of the new untamable chaotic frontier.
Mm,
And I think that in a lot of ways, we haven't yet populated space with dragons. But I think that Cthulhu really serves a very similar purpose. Now, of course,
mm.
it was written as a fiction. People that believe Cthulhu is real should seek help. But it's it is like it's that same instinct, right? And like so there's some confusion, like
Yeah,
as my memory serves, there's some confusion about whether he's at the bottom of the sea or out somewhere in the void, right? Like, or almost in like a
yeah,
Pacific Rim kind of way, it's both, right? Aliens from space, but
yeah,
also they're coming up through the ocean. And
yeah.
so I think in a lot of ways, like Cthulhu is like a very modern godless Chaoskampf. Right? There's no creator
Well,
god coming to save you,
yeah,
but
yeah.
there's
That's
this,
that's an interesting thing.
but there is, this ineffable creature. And he's not very draconic in his imperial. He does have like the bat wings, I guess, but like he's not
Yeah.
particularly draconic in his appearance. But he's that force that will just break you uncaringly.
No, that's interesting, and I think it leaves us with a little bit of space here for, um, if you like, the sort of draconic impulse has been sort of retrained in a few different places into sort of, I would argue Cthulhu is, cosmic horror, a little bit of nihilism kind of thrown in there as
Mhm.
well, and just the sense of just the meaninglessness, existential dread of facing a kind of cold, indifferent universe kind of like mentality. Where this idea, I heard this once, the Earth is kind of a garden in the void of space, and it's like a very, we're kind of sailing on a very small ship in the middle of a vast expanse of nothing, and
And
stuff,
speaking of expanses, Leviathan Wakes,
the
right?
expanse.
The title of the first Expanse book, for those who have only seen the series or aren't
Yeah,
familiar at
yeah.
all, is Leviathan Wakes. And it's like
And
that idea of this untamable horror out there in the depths.
yeah, and it's interesting because even that, like, there's a lot of theory going on my favorite website, Reddit, about about the expanse. And one of the things they talk about is that the protomolecule species may have been slow life, that hijacks fast life. And so this idea of just these guys are just real happy, they'll hang out for thousands of years. Does not bother them. There's an intelligence to them, but it is just incredibly slow moving, and they hijack fast life to build stuff for them. And so it's like a really, like, it's an interesting thing, but it's one that has a basis in biology, and it's just this idea of highly intelligent, functionally like I think it's almost like a kind of algae functionally like this hyper
Yeah.
intelligent algae. And so it's a really neat concept, and you're right. Like those books, they've got a whole pile of names that speak to Chaoskampf as a notion, and the whole thing about leviathans and storm gods and stuff like that. And if you read through it, it's got a lot of that. Last book was Leviathan Falls, which was just a flipping
Mm.
tight name for a book as well. So and it is interesting taking this idea of let's call it like just the draconic impulse, right? Like which is going to have it's going to have connotations, right? Because like something being draconian has a it's a meaning as well, being dragon like and being greedy and cruel. But like this sort of desire to name the forces of chaos and disorder, and at least, and a better way to put it may be things we do not fully understand. We have this desire to name them. We have this desire to personify them to some degree. We have this desire to make them into something that can be fought by something else. And I don't know if comfort is the right word. You know what I mean? I don't know if it gives us
Mhm.
comfort. It gives us something though. Like there's something we're getting out of this feeling where we can look at the vast expanse and go like, we're trying to apply meaning in it in some way. You know what I mean? It's even if the meaning is a lack of
Yeah.
meaning, we're trying to name
Or
it.
or the
You
meaning,
know?
or we're just trying to define the meaning that we know is there, but is more than we can comprehend. Right?
Yeah,
Like there is meaning to it all,
yeah,
but being able to like comprehend it is a whole different thing. Being able to put like
yeah,
a name or a face to it, um, and maybe that's why the older myths resonate with me more so than Cthulhu does,
yeah.
because while I might not agree with the particulars in a lot of cases, like
Hmm.
there's a reason I have Gustave Doré's like Yahweh slays the Leviathan hanging on my wall, like because it's really cool woodcutting art, but also
Yeah.
because it's like it's sort of there as a reminder of like, yeah, it's crazy out there. That doesn't mean just because it's out of control from my perspective doesn't mean that I'm just waiting for the cold grip of death, and the heat death of the universe. You know.
This is a neat place sort of to just like bring it to a close on the question of how these Leviathan fit into settings. And like we've seen loads of different examples of this. Like, I mean, I mentioned Toothless, How to Train Your Dragon, right? Is like an interesting thing. They are sort of this force of nature, and in a way it's like
Mhm.
the Vikings of Burke. Um uh what is it? Tough and tasteless. The people more so. So the Vikings of Burke are they befriend their nameless, previously nameless chaos. You know what I mean there, and they sort of
Yeah.
that is like a way of responding to that. And I think I look through it, and I kind of every time you see a dragon, and we're still definitely speaking in sort of it's sort of very much the Western tradition. I know you had highlighted like dragons, being a different. Viewed differently in more Eastern contexts, but I think this obsession with sort of a an ancient and powerful chaotic entity that sort of needs a name and needs an analogy to aid us in some form of understanding, and they're defeated, and they're not, and their defeat also is not necessarily always clean. Their defeat is often,
Hmm.
marred with other things happening, whether it's creating the world in some mythologies, or if it's the hero dying, because that is the hero's arc. That is what the hero needs to do to redeem themselves. Whether it's Beowulf, dying of old age, essentially, like, no, we can't have that. He kills a dragon and dies trying, and that's I don't know. I think that's really cool. I guess my question
Yeah.
then following this up is as we sort of lean into sort of the practical elements of this when people are creating their settings, how do we make settings that fit dragons, right? Dragons are complex elements. They are powerful, primordial sort of in nature to some degree. And how do we then fit them in a given setting? Because I know our D&D players have like multiple different breeds of dragons, and they all kind of do different things, and they're often wickedly intelligent and collect gold, and like there's a draconography to D&D, and like how they like to operate. But it's also just impractical. Dragons are incredibly powerful. How do you then graft them into a setting? You know, what do you have some thoughts on that?
I think there's a number of ways you can approach it. You can you can almost think of there's a bunch of different sliders that you can move back and forth. The size of a dragon, the power of a dragon, the intelligence. Like, are they a sapient race?
Hmm.
Um, are they kind of unique supernatural beings that don't have to abide by biological rules? Because if that's the case, you can have like a one-off dragon that like it's the dragon that guards that mountain and the hoard of gold in it. Like, and he just
Yeah.
does that, and that's his thing. That's what he likes to do. Like, that's Smaug, right? And that's also like that comes out of the Norse tradition as well, with Fafnir, and the dragon that was in that case like born a dwarf and became a dragon because he was greedy, question mark. Like, so there's you can handle it however you want to, and like however it fits into your story. So
Hmm.
um like I have some of these elements in some of my stories as like personifications of the void. I have planet sized monsters out in space, and they can just kind of be out there until I'm ready for them to come closer. And they're ineffable, and they're not intelligent in a way that we would understand intelligence.
Hmm.
And they can just sort of be used the way I want to use them because of those properties.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that any creator can do the same. Like,
Hmm.
it is, in my view, perfectly acceptable to just sort of take the stock dragon sitting on a hoard of gold off the shelf, throw it into your manuscript, and see where it goes.
Hmm.
I think that sort of gardening mentality is the best way to approach it, in my opinion. Like, the only way to figure out if it's going to work is to write it, or at least to plot it out and get to a point where you're like, no, this doesn't work because of this and that. And that's what second drafts are for. Like,
Yeah.
you want dragons? You throw some dragons in, see where it goes.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know if that answers the question exactly.
No,
Um,
I think that's a very world craftian sort of answer to a lot of this, is like your best the best way you can figure out if something works is to sort of just throw it into the mix and experiment a little. Like, I think that question, how does it write, is a very good, like, sort of answer to some of that. And it's like you think too hard about any one element of it, like dragons, sitting on a hoard of gold, and like, is that gold building interest, or why don't the dragons collect fine art? That's like a more efficient way to do it. Like, you know what I mean? There's like a million things you could talk about, and
Yeah.
all of those things would be very, very interesting if your story was about that. You know what I mean? It's like you
Hmm.
could easily do a very interesting short story of a dragon that, collects patents instead of like, gold or something. And it's just like an extremely gifted like copywriter, and like has, and just, really knows how to connect talent to people. And it's like, is basically an agent. You could easily create something like that. And that would be an interesting story to tell if that was the story you were telling, right? But there was a reason, you've got Beowulf fighting Gorgon, right? Is it Gordon? Gorgon?
Grendel?
Grendel. There you go. So yeah, sorry, Gorgons, Greek mythology, right? The Gorgons.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
but
Yes.
so you've got Beowulf fighting Grendel, and Grendel has a certain role to play in the story, and
Hmm.
Beowulf has a certain role to play in the story, and a character arc and an adventure that he's going on. And I think that's really like, in my view, I think the question in some ways is, what does your character have to overcome? I think is an interesting sort of question to ask that is very general to stories, but is a thing I think that is particularly draconic as well. Like it's very, dragon sort of centered, is it's overcoming something, it's defeating something. And if
Hmm.
it comes into like outsmarting the patent holding copywriter dragon, like that could be again a very, very interesting story. And like the question is though, is your silver tongue thief with a heart of gold going to give those patents back to the inventors or not at the end, or keep them for himself, you know that I think about covers it. We've covered a lot of ground here. So kind of the
Yeah.
the origins of dragon stories, how they kind of seem to pop up everywhere. They have this sort of primordial origin to them. We talked about how Cthulhu kind of fits almost into the era of the vast expanse of space and sort of the unknowableness of it and the anxiety that we might feel about that. How really the role dragons often play in stories is something for the hero to overcome, and that has a lot of historical precedent in it. But then kind of pose this question, what is it the hero needs to overcome? Does it look like a straight, hammer and tongs victory, or like Beowulf, is the victory dying in battle? Is that really what was needed for that character? Does our silver tongued scoundrel with a heart of gold like find a way to outsmart the dragon and then give the money away because that was their arc, that was the right thing for them to do? And so I think that's really the role of it. And as ever with the Worldcraft Club, we come back to this same notion of just, how does it write? If you have a notion to throw, distant space dragons into your story, throw them in there. See how they fit, how they write, how they might contribute to the story. And the question always is like, people who cite world building problems are usually first victims of story problems. And I think the question is not, how does the dragon fit into your world, but how does the dragon fit into your story? And I think the world can kind of come after. If you want to include some breadcrumbs and some trappings, like you can do along the way in order to secure the dragon's place in the setting. Rumors of dragons, discussions of dragons here and there, the predations of dragons, the problems dragons cause as you go through the story. That's a good way to sort of breadcrumb them into your world. But really, what role does the dragon play in your story? So thanks so much for listening to the Worldcraft Club. We're really delighted that you were able to join us. We have a Discord server where you can have discussions that go into just ridiculous levels of detail with folks on the server, including Dave and myself. So we'd absolutely Love for you to join. And if you haven't already, check out the World Builders Journal. Great product that we developed a little while back through a Kickstarter, really successful Kickstarter, super proud of it. And it sort of distills a lot of the methodologies that we discuss through this podcast into a simple format that's really useful for writers to kind of lay out their settings in a way that was very conducive to story writing. So we hope you'll check that out as well. Link in the show notes. And for Dave, I'm James. Thank you so much for joining us. That's the longest I could make that sound for.